Now, the big global story of the day, African Union Chair and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has told the annual debate of the United Nations General Assembly that COVID-19 will inevitably set back the continent's developmental aspirations. He was addressing the world body in a pre-recorded message due to the hybrid model adopted by the UN as a result of the pandemic. Ramaphosa warned the international community that the redirection of resources had set back efforts in multiple sectors, including housing and education, whilst backing the Secretary-General's call for a new global deal. The presidents of the United States and China also spoke in today's opening session.
It is a call that we as South Africa wholly endorse. It is in the spirit of this new global deal that we call on the international community and our international partners to support the rollout of a comprehensive stimulus package for African countries. This will enable African countries to not only mitigate the health impacts of COVID-19, but to aid us in the immense task of rebuilding our shattered economies. To ensure that no country is left behind, we reiterate our position as the African Union that economic sanctions against Zimbabwe and Sudan should be lifted to allow their governments to respond adequately to the pandemic.
As we pursue this bright future, we must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world, China. The Chinese government and the World Health Organization, which is virtually controlled by China, falsely declared that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission. Later, they falsely said people without symptoms would not spread the disease. The United Nations must hold China accountable for their actions.
面对疫情
Facing the virus, we should enhance solidarity and get this through together. We should follow the guidance of science, give full play to the leading role of the World Health Organization, and launch a joint international response to beat this pandemic. Any attempt of politicizing the issue or stigmatization must be rejected.
Well, for more on the dramatic opening session, we're joined by correspondent Sherwin Bryce Pease, who joins us live from the United Nations in New York. Sherwin, welcome as always. Before we get to some of the other speakers, give us a fuller recap of what President Ramaphosa told the Assembly earlier today.
Hi there, Francis. Yes, wearing two hats today as African Union chairperson and, of course, as South Africa's head of state. President Cyril Ramaphosa really trying to cover a lot of ground, focused largely on COVID-19, as one would expect, but also touching on a few other areas, including calling on the United Nations, Francis, to spare no effort to end prejudice and intolerance in all its forms. He even gave a shout-out to the Black Lives Matter movement. He talked about the importance of eradicating gender-based violence and femicide in the context of women's empowerment, and continental efforts to finalize and adopt an AU Convention on Violence Against Women. He urged that the 75th anniversary of this global body, you'll remember that it's the 75th anniversary of the United Nations this year, and use that moment to reinvigorate efforts to reform the UN Security Council. And as a sidebar on that call for reform of the Council, I just want to tell you what Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, said during his speech earlier, Francis. He said, while the United Nations Security Council should be more inclusive of the views of other countries, as well as their positions, base its work on the position of the broadest possible consensus of states, but at the same time it should continue to serve as a cornerstone of global governance, which cannot be achieved unless the permanent members of the Security Council retain their veto power. Putin continued, such a right pertaining to the 5 nuclear powers and the victors of the Second World War remains indicative of the actual political and military balance of power today. So that really is goes against what Africa has been calling for in terms of the Eswatini consensus. They want 2 permanent seats with the veto. It's going to be interesting to see Africa's dynamics play itself out with that Russian position. But as I said earlier, President Ramaphosa very focused on the COVID-19 response, including the alleviation of debt payments by African countries. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Also call for the suspension of interest payments on Africa's external and public debt. As the African Union, we are encouraged by the collaboration of the G20, the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN towards finding solutions to debt sustainability in developing countries. This pandemic has highlighted the urgency with which we must strive to meet all the sustainable development goals, but more importantly, Goal 1, to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. For until we eradicate global poverty, we will always fall short of realizing the vision of the founders of the United Nations.
President Ramaphosa also reaffirming South Africa's commitment to multilateralism and to the ideals and spirit of the UN Charter. Francis.
So, Sharon, you ran us through what Russia had to say, a big blow, I think, for our aspirations for change at the UN. And the big hitters earlier, China and the United States, we had some excerpts. And as expected, President Trump used the opportunity to attack China over COVID-19 again. Now, how did that play out, particularly with China speaking quite soon after the United States?
Well, we had a background briefing earlier, sort of setting ourselves up for this high-level week with the Chinese ambassador last week, Francis, and the question was raised at that luncheon as to whether he would be expecting an attack from Washington in the General Assembly, and certainly the affirmative was received from the permanent representative. Really two starkly different visions of how the world works. Remember, the context here is a theme for this gathering, the future we want, the UN we need, affirming our collective commitment to multilateralism. But what we heard from the US Commander-in-Chief was very much an inward-looking portrayal of what the United States is doing. He talked about, how he had spent some $4 trillion on building up military capacity in the United States, building the strongest economy in the world. President Trump talked about how they had a surplus of ventilators and were able to share that with friends and partners around the world. He talked about that normalization deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain that was ushered in under the auspices of the United States. He said that America was fulfilling its destiny as a peacemaker. He criticized leaders, Francis, for pursuing global ambitions at the expense of their own people. He said he was proudly putting America first. American prosperity was a bedrock for freedom and security around the world. And as you saw in that clip we played earlier, of course, going at China, attacking China, blaming China for COVID-19. And a few speakers later, Xi Jinping had the floor. He said they had no intention of entering a Cold War or a hot war with any country. He criticized the politicization and the stigmatization that has come attached with COVID-19. He talked about COVID-19, that this will not be the last crisis to confront humanity, so we must join hands and be prepared to meet even more global challenges. So very different views. You had an attack from President Trump and China kind of talking to the theme of this meeting about their role in kind of the developmental agenda that is so important for the world's second largest economy.
Very interesting indeed, that contrast. And another important speech from the UN chief himself, Antonio Guterres, also talking about COVID-19, how it's laid bare the world's fragilities. And we've seen inequality, climate change, rampant corruption, all more exposed. What else did he talk about?
Well, his big push in the aftermath of COVID-19, his call in as early as March this year for a global ceasefire, right? That's the big game that's at play in terms of how the world builds back better. Let's stop fighting. Let's stop the conflicts. And so that was adopted by the UN Security Council. But of course, conflicts have not ceased around the world. So that was a big part of his speech. This is a quote from him. People are hurting, our planet is burning, our world is struggling and stressed and seeking real leadership and action. This is what he also had to say about the world's response to COVID-19. Let's listen.
We are working to advance treatments and therapies as a global public good and backing efforts for a people's vaccine available and affordable everywhere. We know some countries are reportedly making side deals exclusive for their own populations. Such vaccine nationalism is not only unfair, it is self-defeating. None of us is safe until all of us are safe. Everybody knows that. Likewise, economies cannot run with a runaway pandemic. Since the beginning, we have pushed for a massive rescue package worth at least 10% of the global economy. Now, developed countries have provided enormous relief for their own societies, and they can afford it. But we need to ensure that the developing world does not fall into financial ruin, escalating poverty, and debt crisis.
So the UN chief very much feeding into what the AU chairperson was saying earlier in terms of global responsibility in really helping the shattered economies as a result of COVID-19. But worth repeating, Francis, vaccine nationalism, that's a word you're probably going to hear as we move closer to an effective vaccine later this year. He says it's not only unfair, it is also self-defeating. Vaccine nationalism. There's a new one.
Thank you so much for a great comprehensive wrap. That was SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Peace.